New Year's Eve was supposed to mean something. A pause, a reset, a moment where even broken things pretend they can begin again. But that night my husband looked at me like I was a problem he didn't want to carry into the new year. "Please don't come," he said. Not angry, not loud. Worse than that. Embarrassed. "You'll just make people uncomfortable." He didn't say who would be uncomfortable. He didn't explain why. He just turned back to his phone. As if the conversation was already over. As if I had already been erased from the night. "My name is Rachel Monroe. And before I tell you what happened next, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel. Because these are stories about strength, quiet endurance, and women who finally stopped shrinking. And before we continue, tell me in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? Now listen closely, because one sentence changed everything. Andrew left just after 7, wearing his tailored suit, carrying that confident smile he saved for people who impressed him more than I did. "I'll text you when I'm back," he said. And he didn't. The apartment felt too quiet, like it knew it hadn't been chosen. I changed into something comfortable, turned on the television, then muted it, because the noise only made the silence louder. The countdown crawled forward. 11:58. 11:59. Fireworks popping somewhere far away. Celebrations I wasn't invited to. Lives continuing without me. At midnight, nothing happened. No message. No apology. No call. Just silence. And I stood by the window watching strangers hug, laugh, kiss, while I told myself this was temporary, that this wasn't who I was, that this night didn't get to define me. Then at 12:01 a.m., my phone rang. Andrew's name lit up the screen, and something tight closed around my chest. As I answered, his voice wasn't confident anymore. It wasn't controlled. It was shaking. "Rachel," he whispered, "what did you do?" I looked at the clock again. 12:01 a.m., and in that moment I knew whatever had just happened out there was about to turn my quiet New Year's Eve into something no one could ignore. Andrew hadn't always spoken to me like that. With distance, with quiet dismissal, with that tone that suggested I was something inconvenient he had to manage rather than someone he loved. When we first met, he listened to me. Really listened. Asked questions about my work, my ideas, the things I was building in my head long before they existed on paper. He said he admired how my mind worked. Said it made him feel lucky. Back then, I believed him. We married fast. Not recklessly, but confidently. Or, at least that's how it felt at the time. Andrew had plans, ambition, momentum, and I thought standing beside him meant we were moving forward together. But somewhere along the way, together quietly turned into behind him. It didn't happen all at once. It never does. It happened in small moments that were easy to excuse. Andrew introducing me as supportive instead of brilliant, laughing lightly when investors asked what I did, saying things like, "Rachel helps in her own way," as if my work existed in a different, smaller category. I told myself it was temporary, that once things stabilized, once his company took off, things would balance out again. They didn't. Instead, Andrew's world grew louder, and mine grew quieter. Meetings I wasn't invited to, dinners where my opinions were brushed aside, conversations that stopped the moment I entered the room. And every time I noticed, Andrew had an explanation ready. "You're reading too much into it. They wouldn't understand. It's just not the right time." The right time became a moving target, always just out of reach. What hurt the most wasn't the exclusion. It was the way he framed it as protection, like he was doing me a favor by keeping me invisible. Like my presence was something that needed to be managed carefully so it didn't disturb his carefully built image. I remember one night, years before New Year's Eve, standing in the kitchen while Andrew rehearsed a presentation. He stumbled over a technical detail, paused, then repeated something I had explained to him weeks earlier, word for word. When I pointed it out gently, he smiled and said, "See, that's why you're good at this stuff." Then turned back to his slides and never mentioned my contribution again. That was the first time I felt it clearly. That strange, hollow feeling. The sense that pieces of me were being quietly absorbed into someone else's success, without acknowledgement, without consent. Still, I stayed quiet, not because I was weak, but because I was watching. I started saving emails, drafts, early sketches, timestamps, moments that proved what I knew but didn't yet say out loud. I didn't confront Andrew. I didn't accuse. I didn't fight. I just kept going. Building, documenting, waiting. Because somewhere deep down, I understood something important. People who erase you rarely expect you to remember exactly who you are. And as I stood there on New Year's Eve, phone still warm in my hand from Andrew's shaking call, I realized this moment, this silence, this rejection, wasn't the beginning of my loss. It was the moment everything I had been quietly preparing for finally began to surface. Andrew's confidence didn't come from nowhere. It was built, layer by layer, on rooms I was quietly pushed out of, conversations I wasn't meant to finish, and credit that slowly stopped carrying my name. There was a pattern, and once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. At dinners with his partners, Andrew would talk about our early days. But somehow the stories always centered on his risk, his vision, his courage. My role reduced to encouragement, patience, emotional support, the invisible labor no one claps for. When someone asked directly what I did, Andrew would answer for me. Smoothly, kindly. "Rachel's brilliant, but she prefers to stay behind the scenes." As if that choice had ever been mine, I would smile, nod, let the moment pass, and tell myself it wasn't worth correcting. Not tonight. Not in front of people who had already decided who mattered. That's how erasure works. Quietly, politely, wrapped in compliments that still manage to make you smaller. The night Andrew introduced Carl Bennett to me, everything became clearer. Carl shook my hand, glanced at my notes on the table, then laughed lightly and said, "So you're the reason Andrew sounds smart in meetings." Like it was a joke. Like it wasn't the truth accidentally slipping out. Andrew laughed too. He didn't look at me. That was the moment I understood. He wasn't unaware. He was choosing this. After that, I stopped hoping he would correct the narrative and started preparing for what would happen when the narrative finally broke. I met with Michael Reeves quietly, not as a threat, not as a warning, but as insurance. We talked about ownership, timelines, documentation, what it meant to protect work that had been shared too freely in the name of love. Michael asked me once, "Why now?" I told him the truth, because one day he's going to act like I don't belong at all. Michael didn't argue. He just nodded, like someone who had seen this story before. Back home, Andrew grew more comfortable with his version of events, more careless, sending me drafts to review, asking questions without credit, forwarding emails where my ideas appeared under his name, never once thinking I was keeping track. Why would he? I was quiet, agreeable, supportive, the safest kind of witness. By the time New Year's Eve arrived, Andrew no longer thought of my absence as something to explain. It was just assumed, expected, easier. So when he told me not to come, when he said I'd make people uncomfortable, he wasn't inventing cruelty. He was simply saying out loud what he had been practicing for years. And standing there alone, phone still glowing in my hand, Andrew's panicked voice echoing in my ears, I felt something shift. Not anger, not satisfaction. Clarity. Because whatever had just broken at 12:01 a.m. wasn't only his illusion of control. It was the story he'd been telling the world, and the silence he'd mistaken for my weakness. And for the first time, I didn't feel erased. I felt ready. I didn't answer Andrew right away. Not because I wanted to punish him, but because I needed to understand what had just changed. His breathing was uneven on the line, rushed, unfamiliar. The sound of a man who had just realized the ground beneath him wasn't solid. "Rachel," he said again, softer this time. "Are you there?" But I stayed quiet, because silence, when chosen, is different from silence when forced. Finally, I asked one simple question. "What happened?" He hesitated, and that hesitation told me everything. "They're saying your name," he whispered. "It's everywhere. The news, the alerts, my phone won't stop vibrating." "Rachel, what did you do?" I looked at the muted television, the dark screen reflecting my own face back at me. Calm, steady, unrecognizable even to myself. "I didn't do anything tonight," I said. "Honestly, I did it years ago." Andrew didn't understand. Not yet. And I didn't explain. Because this moment wasn't about helping him catch up. It was about letting him finally feel what I had lived with for so long. Confusion, uncertainty, fear of being left behind. After we hung up, I turned the television back on. There it was. My name scrolling across the bottom of the screen. Slow, deliberate, impossible to miss. Laura Chen's voice filled the room. Controlled, serious, talking about innovation, patents, early filings, a breakthrough years in the making that had just gone public at midnight. Exactly as planned. Not overnight success. Not luck. Not a miracle. Work. Mine. My phone started lighting up. Messages, emails, numbers I hadn't heard from in years. Congratulations. Questions, invitations, and through it all, Andrew's name stayed silent. For the first time, he didn't know where I was, what I was doing, or how to reach me emotionally. And that scared him. I remembered the night, long ago, when I first filed the paperwork, sitting alone at the same kitchen table, heart pounding, hand shaking, knowing that protecting myself meant accepting that one day I might need protection from my own husband. It wasn't revenge. It was survival. Back then, Andrew had been celebrating a small win of his own, pouring champagne, talking about the future, while I quietly clicked submit, sealing something I hoped I'd never need to use. But now, standing there on New Year's Eve, watching the world finally see what I had built, I understood why that version of me had been brave enough to plan ahead. Because people who benefit from your silence will always ask why you waited, but they never ask why you needed to. Andrew called again, this time frantic, his voice cracking through the speaker. "You have to fix this. Kyle's calling. Investors are calling. They think." I interrupted him, gently, firmly. "They don't think anything. Andrew, they're finally seeing." There was a pause on the line. Long, heavy, and then a question that told me the truth had finally reached him. "Are you saying," he whispered, "this was never really mine?" I closed my eyes, breathed once, deeply, and for the first time, I didn't feel the need to soften the answer. "No," I said, "it never was." Andrew didn't speak after that. The line stayed open, filled with shallow breaths and the distant echo of voices around him. A room full of people realizing something was very wrong. I imagined the scene without seeing it, the party frozen mid-laugh, glasses half raised, faces turning toward him as his expression changed. The moment confidence drains out of a man who's built his identity on control. "Rachel," he said finally, slower now, careful. "You need to tell me exactly what's going on." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because for years I had asked him the same thing. Gently, patiently, and he had never thought I deserved an explanation. "I told you," I said. "Nothing happened tonight. It just stopped being hidden." Another voice cut in on his end. Kyle's. Sharp, urgent, asking questions Andrew didn't know how to answer. And suddenly Andrew wasn't speaking to me anymore. He was speaking to the room. "I'll handle it," he said to them. A reflex. A lie he had relied on for too long. I ended the call. Not dramatically. Not angrily, just quietly, like closing a door that no longer led anywhere. The phone kept buzzing anyway. Notifications stacking. Articles updating. Headlines shifting as more outlets picked up the story. My work, my name, no longer attached to someone else's narrative. I sat down on the couch, heart racing, not with fear, but with something unfamiliar. Relief. Because the waiting was over. For years, I had lived inside the question of when would he go too far? When would my silence cost me more than it protected? When would the truth demand to be seen? The answer, apparently,
was now.
Another call came through. Michael Reeves this time. Calm, steady, exactly as he had promised he would be. "It's live," he said. "All of it. The filings, the disclosures, the attribution. There's no putting this back." "I know," I replied. "Are you safe?" he asked. The question landed deeper than he probably intended. "Yes," I said, and realized it was true. After we hung up, I poured myself a glass of water, hands still shaking, and stood by the window again, watching fireworks fade into smoke, listening to cheers drift up from the street below. The world was celebrating a new year, unaware that my old life had just ended. Andrew called again. And again, messages piling up. Apologies forming too quickly to be sincere. Promises he didn't yet understand he could no longer make. I didn't respond, because this moment, this space between who I had been and who I was becoming, needed quiet. And somewhere across the city, surrounded by people who had just learned the truth, Andrew was finally feeling what it meant to lose control of a story he never owned. At exactly 12:14 a.m., my phone vibrated one last time. A news alert. Short, unmistakable, confirming what Andrew was trying desperately not to accept. Sources confirm Rachel Monroe as the sole architect behind the breakthrough technology. I stared at the words, long enough for them to sink in, long enough to understand that nothing after this would be the same. And for the first time that night, I smiled. By late afternoon, the story had grown teeth. What started as headlines turned into questions, then demands, then pressure Andrew could no longer smooth over with charm or timing. Kyle Bennett called me first, not Andrew. His voice was tight, rehearsed, the sound of someone trying to regain control of a room that had already turned on him. "Rachel, we need to talk," he said. "This is getting complicated." "It's actually very clear," I replied calmly. "The documents speak for themselves." Kyle hesitated, then lowered his voice. "The board is calling an emergency meeting tonight." That was the moment Andrew had spent years pretending would never come. "What kind of meeting?" I asked. Kyle exhaled, the kind where people stop assuming and start verifying. After we hung up, I stared at my phone for a long moment, not with fear, but with recognition. This was the room Andrew had always controlled, the room I was never invited into, and tonight it was finally going to ask the right questions. Andrew called minutes later, frantic now, pacing evident even through the speaker. "Kyle talked to you, didn't he?" "Yes," I said simply. "You can't let them do this," he insisted. "They're acting like I misled them." "You did," I replied, without raising my voice. There was a pause on the line. Sharp, stunned. For a second, I thought he might apologize, not strategically, not defensively, but honestly. Instead, he said, "If you walk into that meeting with them, you'll destroy everything I built." I leaned back against the couch, steady. "No," I said, "I'll just stop pretending it was yours." Another pause followed. Heavier this time. His voice cracked, not loud, not angry, just scared. "Do you even understand what you're doing to us?" That word. Us. Arriving far too late. "I understand exactly what I'm doing," I replied. "I'm choosing not to disappear anymore." He tried to bargain after that, promises stacked on promises, a sudden interest in fairness, credit, recognition, all the things he had never offered when the cost was mine alone. I let him speak, because listening was no longer the same as agreeing. When the call ended, my phone buzzed again, this time an email. The subject line was short, clinical, unmistakable. Board meeting, 7 p.m. Attendance required. I read it twice, then once more, feeling the weight of what that invitation meant. Not revenge, not spectacle, but acknowledgement. Outside, the sun dipped lower, the city shifting into evening, and for the first time since midnight, I felt nerves. Not doubt, not regret, anticipation. Because tonight, the room Andrew had ruled for years was about to hear a story he never thought would be told by the one person he never expected to speak. And as I stood up, slipping on my coat, preparing to step into a space that had never been meant for me, I understood something with sudden clarity. The real test wasn't whether Andrew would lose control. It was whether I would finally claim mine. By late afternoon, the story had grown teeth. What started as headlines turned into questions, then demands, then pressure Andrew could no longer smooth over with charm or timing. Kyle Bennett called me first, not Andrew. His voice was tight, rehearsed, the sound of someone trying to regain control of a room that had already turned on him. "Rachel, we need to talk," he said. "This is getting complicated." "It's actually very clear," I replied calmly. "The documents speak for themselves." Kyle hesitated, then lowered his voice. "The board is calling an emergency meeting tonight." That was the moment Andrew had spent years pretending would never come. "What kind of meeting?" I asked. Kyle exhaled, the kind where people stop assuming and start verifying. After we hung up, I stared at my phone for a long moment, not with fear, but with recognition. This was the room Andrew had always controlled, the room I was never invited into, and tonight it was finally going to ask the right questions. Andrew called minutes later, frantic now, pacing evident even through the speaker. "Kyle talked to you, didn't he?" "Yes," I said simply. "You can't let them do this," he insisted. "They're acting like I misled them." "You did," I replied, without raising my voice. There was a pause on the line. Sharp, stunned. For a second, I thought he might apologize, not strategically, not defensively, but honestly. Instead, he said, "If you walk into that meeting with them, you'll destroy everything I built." I leaned back against the couch, steady. "No," I said, "I'll just stop pretending it was yours." Another pause followed. Heavier this time. His voice cracked, not loud, not angry, just scared. "Do you even understand what you're doing to us?" That word. Us. Arriving far too late. "I understand exactly what I'm doing," I replied. "I'm choosing not to disappear anymore." He tried to bargain after that, promises stacked on promises, a sudden interest in fairness, credit, recognition, all the things he had never offered when the cost was mine alone. I let him speak, because listening was no longer the same as agreeing. When the call ended, my phone buzzed again, this time an email. The subject line was short, clinical, unmistakable. Board meeting, 7 p.m. Attendance required. I read it twice, then once more, feeling the weight of what that invitation meant. Not revenge, not spectacle, but acknowledgement. Outside, the sun dipped lower, the city shifting into evening, and for the first time since midnight, I felt nerves. Not doubt, not regret, anticipation. Because tonight, the room Andrew had ruled for years was about to hear a story he never thought would be told by the one person he never expected to speak. And as I stood up, slipping on my coat, preparing to step into a space that had never been meant for me, I understood something with sudden clarity. The real test wasn't whether Andrew would lose control. It was whether I would finally claim mine. The boardroom didn't look the way I imagined it would. No drama, no raised voices, no cinematic tension, just a long table, neutral walls, and people who suddenly looked very careful about every word they chose. Andrew was already there when I walked in, seated near the head of the table, posture stiff, jaw tight, eyes flicking up the moment he saw me. For the first time in years, he looked unsure where I fit. Kyle stood to greet me, overly polite now, gesturing toward an empty chair across from Andrew, a deliberate placement that didn't go unnoticed. "Thank you for coming, Rachel," he said, voice formal, as if formality could restore balance. I sat down without speaking, hands folded, breathing steady, reminding myself that I didn't need to perform to be heard. The meeting started exactly on time. A projector lit up the wall, slides moving quickly, charts, dates, filings, timelines, all the things Andrew used to control with confidence, now stripped of narrative and reduced to facts. No one looked at him while the evidence appeared. One board member cleared her throat and said, "We need clarification on the origin of this work." Andrew opened his mouth, then stopped. The pause stretched, uncomfortable, revealing. I felt it then, the shift, not toward me, but away from him. "I can explain," Andrew said finally, leaning forward, voice measured. "Rachel and I collaborated early on. It was informal, supportive." I didn't interrupt. I didn't need to. Michael Reeves spoke next, calm, precise, every word placed with intention. The documentation shows sole authorship, independent filings, and dated records predating any corporate involvement. He turned slightly, acknowledging me without spectacle. The room absorbed that quietly. Andrew's fingers tightened around his pen. Someone asked him why his name appeared where it shouldn't. Someone else asked why disclosures hadn't been made sooner. The question stacked, not aggressively, but relentlessly, the way truth tends to do when it no longer needs permission. Andrew tried to answer them all, explanations blurring together, confidence thinning with every sentence, until finally one of the board members said, "That's enough." Silence settled. Not hostile, just final. They asked me then directly to speak. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I explained what I built, when I built it, and why I protected it. I spoke about patience, about trust, about believing that recognition would come without having to demand it. No one interrupted. Andrew stared at the table. When I finished, the chairwoman nodded slowly and said, "Thank you for your clarity." That word, clarity, landed heavier than praise ever could. They asked Andrew to step out. He looked at me then, eyes searching, not for forgiveness, but for rescue. I didn't move. The door closed behind him, softly, and for the first time since the meeting began, I exhaled. Not because I had won, but because I no longer needed to explain myself to the wrong person. And as the board began discussing next steps, I realized something quietly profound. Power doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes, it simply stops asking for permission. When Andrew stepped back into the boardroom, something had changed. It wasn't dramatic, no slammed doors, no raised voices, just a subtle shift in how people looked at him, like they were seeing him clearly for the first time and realizing the image no longer matched the facts. He took his seat again, slower now, careful, as if every movement needed approval. The chairwoman folded her hands and spoke evenly. "We've reviewed the materials, and we need to discuss next steps." Andrew nodded too quickly, already preparing a defense that no one had asked for. Kyle avoided his eyes. One of the board members leaned forward and said, "Effective immediately, we're commissioning an independent review of all intellectual property attributed to this company." Andrew's jaw tightened. Another added, "Until that review is complete, your authority over product direction is suspended." The words landed softly, but their meaning was sharp. Andrew opened his mouth, then closed it, clearly measuring whether speaking would help or hurt him now. It didn't take long for him to choose silence. They turned to me again, not as an afterthought, not as a courtesy, but as a source. "Rachel," the chairwoman said, "we'd like to formally acknowledge your role and discuss how you'd like to proceed." Andrew looked up sharply. I felt his stare, heavy, disbelieving, like he was watching the ground move beneath his feet and realizing he couldn't stop it. "I'd like the work to stand on its own," I said calmly, without being filtered through anyone else's narrative. There was a pause. Brief, thoughtful. That's reasonable, she replied. Andrew exhaled through his nose, frustration slipping through despite his effort to stay composed. This is getting blown out of proportion, he said, trying once more to regain control. We're talking about a misunderstanding between spouses. I met his eyes for the first time since entering the room. No, I said quietly, we're talking about attribution. The room stayed still. That was the moment I felt it, not triumph, not revenge, but separation, a clean line drawn between what was his to manage and what was never his to take. The meeting wrapped up quickly after that, logistics replacing emotion, timelines replacing excuses, and Andrew was asked to remain behind while others filtered out. Kyle passed me on the way to the door, hesitation in his step, then said softly, "I'm sorry." I nodded once, not because it fixed anything, but because it acknowledged reality. In the hallway, Andrew finally caught up to me. "Rachel," he said, lowering his voice, "we shouldn't be doing this here." I stopped walking. "We didn't do this here," I replied. "We just stopped pretending." His shoulders sagged slightly. "This will destroy everything," he said. I looked at him, really looked, and understood how much of his identity had been built on being unquestioned. "No," I said gently. "It will just change who gets credit." He didn't follow me after that. Outside, the evening air felt cooler, steadier, like the city had exhaled with me. My phone buzzed with a message from Michael, short and simple. That went exactly as it needed to. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and kept walking, aware of something new settling in. For the first time, the future didn't feel like something I had to earn permission for. It felt like something I was finally allowed to claim. The fallout didn't wait until morning. By the time I reached home, my phone was already lighting up again, emails marked urgent, missed calls stacking, notifications multiplying faster than I could clear them, proof that once the truth steps into the light, it doesn't slow down for anyone. Andrew didn't call. That silence told me more than any apology could. I poured a glass of water, sat at the kitchen table, and let the noise happen without me, because for the first time, the chaos wasn't mine to manage. An hour later, Michael called, his tone calm, almost reassuring. The board issued a preliminary statement, he said. They're distancing the company from Andrew's narrative. Full review starts immediately. I closed my eyes, not in relief, but in recognition. This was the moment the ground fully shifted. "What about Andrew?" I asked. Michael paused. Just long enough to signal the answer wouldn't be kind. "He's been placed on administrative leave," he said, pending the outcome. Administrative leave. The phrase sounded polite, corporate, harmless, but I knew what it meant. Andrew had been removed from the center of the story he once controlled. After we hung up, I stared at the wall clock, watching the seconds move, realizing how strange it felt to have time again, not borrowed, not negotiated, just mine. Andrew finally called close to midnight. I almost didn't answer. Almost. "Rachel," he said, voice low, measured, trying to sound steady. "You didn't have to let it go this far." I leaned back in my chair, listening, not absorbing. "It went exactly as far as it needed to," I replied. He sighed, frustration breaking through. "They're treating me like I'm disposable." That word, disposable, echoed sharply. "For years," I said quietly, "that's how you treated me." There was a pause. "Longer than before, heavier?" "I was trying to protect us," he said. "No," I replied. "You were protecting the version of you that didn't include me." The silence that followed wasn't angry, it was empty. Finally, he asked, "What do you want?" I considered the question carefully, not emotionally, but honestly. "I want my work to exist without being attached to your name," I said, "and I want space." "Space," he repeated, incredulous. "Yes," I said simply, "real space." He didn't argue. He didn't agree either. He just said, "I don't know who you are anymore." I looked around the apartment, the same walls, the same quiet, and felt no urge to explain myself. "I'm still me," I replied. "You just stopped looking." We ended the call without resolution, without promises, without plans, and for the first time, that felt right. Later that night, I opened my laptop and drafted a single message, short, professional, unmistakable, outlining my terms moving forward: independent representation, independent credit, independent decisions. I sent it before doubt could creep in. As the screen dimmed and the apartment settled into silence, I realized something subtle but powerful. This wasn't the end of my marriage yet, but it was the end of me shrinking to keep it intact. And that knowledge, more than any headline, told me the next chapter had already begun. The next day unfolded like a slow reveal, not explosive, not dramatic, just steady, undeniable movement in a direction Andrew could no longer steer. By mid-morning, the company's statement was everywhere, carefully worded, legally safe, and devastating all the same. Phrases like independent review, clarifying attribution, leadership adjustments repeating across screens, each one quietly carving distance between Andrew and the story he once owned. I watched it happen from the same kitchen table, coffee cooling beside me, laptop open, phone face down, because for the first time I didn't need to track every reaction to feel secure. Michael checked in briefly, confirming timelines, next steps, the kind of practical clarity that replaces panic when things finally move out of the shadows. "You should expect calls," he said. "Media, partners, people who suddenly remember you." "I figured," I replied. And they came. Some were congratulatory, others cautious, a few transparently opportunistic, voices warm with interest now that my name carried weight on its own, and through all of it I kept my answers simple, factual, controlled, refusing to trade dignity for visibility. Andrew texted once, short and sharp, "We need to talk today." I didn't answer right away. When I finally did, it was only to say, "Tonight?" He responded immediately, "At home." I stared at the word home for a long moment, then typed, "Yes." That evening, he arrived earlier than usual, suit wrinkled, tie loose, eyes tired in a way I hadn't seen before, the exhaustion of someone realizing charm doesn't work when trust is gone. He stood in the doorway, uncertain, as if waiting to be invited into a space he no longer recognized. "This has gone too far," he said, skipping pleasantries, frustration leaking through control. "They're talking about restructuring, Rachel, about my position." I didn't interrupt. "You could have stopped it," he continued, voice rising slightly. "One statement, one clarification. We could have handled this privately." I met his gaze calmly. "Privately," I said, "is where it stayed for years." He looked away, jaw tightening. "This isn't how marriage works," he said. I nodded once, slowly. "You're right," I replied. "It isn't." That was when it finally surfaced, the thing he'd been circling since midnight. "Are you leaving?" he asked, quieter now. The question didn't scare me. It clarified me. "I'm stepping back," I said honestly, from us, until I understand what staying would even mean." He ran a hand through his hair, pacing, grasping for ground. "I never meant to erase you," he said. "I know," I replied gently, "but intent doesn't undo impact." We stood there in the space between what had been and what couldn't continue unchanged, and for the first time, neither of us tried to fill the silence with promises. Finally, Andrew nodded, small, reluctant. "Take the time you need," he said. I watched him leave, the door closing softly behind him. Not a slam, not a statement, just an ending that didn't need sound to be real. And as the apartment settled again, I felt something unexpected. Not grief. Not triumph. Relief. Because choosing clarity over comfort had finally given me something I hadn't had in years. Room to breathe. Distance changed everything faster than I expected. Not physical distance, but emotional distance, the kind that gives you space to hear your own thoughts without someone else correcting them. The morning after Andrew left, I woke up without that familiar tightness in my chest, the one that usually came with anticipating his mood, his needs, his version of reality. My phone buzzed early, Michael again, concise as always. "The board voted last night," he said. "They're formalizing your role as independent lead inventor. Public attribution will be corrected across all materials." I sat on the edge of the bed, absorbing the words slowly, not celebrating, not bracing, just letting them land. "Andrew?" I asked. Michael paused. "Just enough to be honest." "He's no longer part of the decision-making process," he said. "They're negotiating his exit." Exit. Such a small word for something that had once defined him. After the call, I made coffee and stood by the window, watching people hurry down the street, unaware that a life had quietly rerouted itself inside this apartment. By noon, Laura Chen's segment aired again, this time with an update, my name spoken clearly, confidently, without hesitation, my work described accurately, without dilution, without footnotes attached to someone else. I didn't watch it twice. Once was enough. Andrew texted, once more that afternoon, "We should talk about the statement." I typed back, "My lawyer will coordinate." The simplicity of that response surprised me, not because it was cold, but because it was clean. I spent the rest of the day doing things I'd postponed for years, organizing files, canceling meetings that no longer made sense, setting boundaries that didn't require explanation. Every small decision felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that had been living on standby. That evening, an email arrived from the board, formal, respectful, outlining options, equity discussions, future collaboration paths that didn't orbit around Andrew's shadow. I read it carefully, then forwarded it to Michael with a single line, "Let's proceed." No hesitation. No apology. Later, as the city softened into night, I realized something subtle had shifted inside me. I wasn't waiting for Andrew to understand anymore. I wasn't hoping for regret to turn into recognition. I was done tying my sense of closure to his capacity for accountability. Andrew called once that night, late, voice tired, stripped of argument. "I never thought it would end like this," he said. I leaned against the counter, listening, not absorbing. "It didn't end," I replied calmly. "It changed." He exhaled, long and heavy. "I don't know where I fit now," he admitted. For a moment, I felt the old instinct rise, the urge to reassure, to soften the truth so it hurt less. "I didn't." "That's something you have to figure out," I said gently. We ended the call without anger, without resolution, without illusion. And as I set my phone down, I understood something important. Justice doesn't always arrive as confrontation. Sometimes it arrives as clarity and the quiet permission to move forward without dragging the past behind you. That night, for the first time in a long while, I slept deeply. Not because everything was settled, but because I was. The days that followed settled into a rhythm I didn't recognize at first, slower, quieter, but steady in a way my life hadn't been for years. Mornings began without negotiation, without checking my phone to see what crisis needed managing, without rehearsing conversations before they happened. I answered messages on my terms, declined invitations that felt premature, and accepted only the ones that respected the boundaries I'd finally drawn. Michael handled the legal choreography with precision, documents revised, credits corrected, ownership clarified, every step reinforcing something I had known all along but never insisted on loudly. My work didn't need a shield anymore. It could stand on its own. The public response surprised me. Not the attention I expected but the tone. Women wrote to me, strangers, telling me pieces of their own stories, how often they had been told to stay quiet, to be patient, to let someone else speak for them. I read every message slowly, realizing how familiar the pattern was, and how rarely it was interrupted. Andrew stayed quiet during that time. No calls, no texts, no attempts to negotiate space he no longer had access to. The silence felt intentional, like he was trying to understand the version of me he could no longer reach. One afternoon, as I was packing files into labeled folders, I found an old notebook from our early years together. Pages filled with sketches, formulas, half-formed ideas written in a handwriting I barely recognized as my own, hopeful, unguarded, trusting. I sat on the floor for a long moment, flipping through it, not with sadness, but with something closer to tenderness. That woman had believed collaboration meant partnership. She hadn't been wrong, just early. The meeting with the board happened again at the end of the week, shorter this time, cleaner. Terms were discussed, timelines agreed upon, my role defined without ambiguity. When it ended, the chairwoman thanked me and said something that stayed with me. "You were patient longer than most," she said, "and prepared better than anyone." Prepared. That word mattered. Because patience without preparation is endurance. Patience with preparation is power. Andrew finally reached out 2 days later, a single message asking if we could talk. No urgency, no pressure. I stared at it for a while, feeling neither fear nor anticipation, just awareness. I agreed to meet him in a neutral place, a quiet cafe near the river, somewhere neither of us could claim as ours. He arrived early, sitting by the window, hands folded, posture smaller than I remembered. When he looked up and saw me, his expression held something unfamiliar, respect, maybe, or resignation. "I owe you an apology," he said after a moment, voice steady but subdued. I listened. Not because I needed it, but because I wanted to see who he was now that control was gone. And as he spoke, carefully, thoughtfully, I realized something quietly profound. This conversation wasn't about saving a marriage anymore. It was about acknowledging an ending. Andrew didn't rush his apology. He didn't dramatize it either, which told me he finally understood this wasn't a performance. "I took your silence as permission," he said, eyes fixed on the river outside the window, and I told myself that meant we were aligned. I nodded slowly, not agreeing, not arguing, just acknowledging the truth of what he'd admitted. "That's the danger of silence," I replied calmly. "People decide what it means without asking." He turned toward me then, studying my face like he was seeing it for the first time, not searching for approval, but recognition. "I didn't think you'd ever step out like this," he said, almost to himself. "I know," I answered. "That's why it worked." The waitress came by, refilled our cups, then moved on, leaving the moment intact, unpressured, honest. Andrew folded his hands, voice quieter now. When the board asked me to explain my role, I realized I couldn't, not without you, and not without the story I'd been telling myself. That sentence mattered. Not because it apologized, because it took responsibility. "I'm not asking you to fix anything," he added quickly, as if afraid of crossing a line. "I just needed to say it out loud." "I appreciate that," I said, and I meant it. But appreciation wasn't reconciliation. We talked for another hour, not about blame, but about reality, about how ambition can slowly turn partnership into ownership if no one stops it, about how easy it is to confuse being supported with being entitled. At one point, Andrew asked the question I knew was coming. "Is there any chance we find our way back?" I didn't answer immediately, not to create tension, but because the answer deserved care. "I don't know," I said honestly, "and I won't pretend I do." That uncertainty didn't frighten me. It grounded me. He nodded, accepting it without protest, which told me more than promises ever could. When we stood to leave, Andrew hesitated, then said, "I'm proud of you." The words landed softly, late, but sincere. "Thank you," I replied. "I'm proud of me too." We walked out separately, no argument, no embrace, just two people acknowledging that something meaningful had ended without needing to be destroyed. Outside, the river moved steadily, indifferent to our conclusions, reminding me that life doesn't pause for clarity, it keeps flowing, waiting for us to decide how we'll move with it. On my way home, I passed the apartment I used to avoid because Andrew liked it too much, the park where I used to sit and wait for him to finish meetings, the places that once felt like holding patterns. They didn't feel that way anymore. They felt neutral. Open. That night, I unpacked the last box of files from my old life, placed them neatly on the shelf, then closed the lid, not as an act of erasure, but completion. Because moving forward didn't require anger. It required honesty. And as I turned off the light, I realized something simple and steady. Closure isn't about tying everything together. It's about knowing when to let go without looking back. The new year unfolded without ceremony, no countdowns, no champagne, just days stacking gently on top of one another, each one quieter than the last, and somehow fuller. I stopped measuring my time by Andrew's schedule, stopped adjusting my energy to fit rooms I no longer entered, and started noticing how much space there actually was when no one was shrinking it for you. Work came first, not as an escape, but as something solid I could return to, meetings where my name was on the agenda for the right reasons, conversations where my voice wasn't translated or softened for comfort. People listened. That still felt strange. I moved my desk closer to the window, let light fall where I used to hide notes, and for the first time, I worked without feeling like I had to justify my presence. One afternoon, a message arrived from Laura Chin, short and respectful, asking if I'd be willing to speak publicly about the journey, not the scandal, but the process. I thought about it carefully. Then I said yes. Not because I wanted attention, but because silence no longer served me. The interview was calm, measured, focused on preparation, on boundaries, on the difference between loyalty and self-erasure. When it aired, I watched it once, not to relive it, but to confirm something important. I sounded like myself. Andrew didn't reach out after that. And surprisingly, that felt like progress. Instead of waiting for something unresolved, I focused on building what came next, partnerships that respected authorship, agreements that didn't rely on trust alone, structures that protected collaboration without ownership confusion. In the evenings, I walked by the river, the same one Andrew had stared at during our last conversation, and realized how differently it looked when it wasn't carrying the weight of expectation. The city kept moving, people passing, conversations overlapping, life happening everywhere at once, and for the first time, I wasn't watching it from the sidelines. I was in it. One night, while sorting through emails, I found a message from the board confirming the final terms: clean, fair, definitive. My role was secure, my work properly attributed, my future no longer tethered to someone else's narrative. I closed the laptop and sat back, letting the moment settle. Not excitement. Not relief. Completion. Because winning wasn't about exposure, or vindication, or watching someone else fall. Winning was waking up and realizing you no longer needed to prove you belonged. And as the year continued, quiet and honest, I understood something that felt both simple and profound. The moment I stopped waiting to be invited, my life finally opened its doors. A year has a way of revealing what was real and what was just noise. By spring, the headlines had cooled, the urgency replaced by something steadier, meetings about growth instead of damage control, conversations about future direction rather than past mistakes. I found myself sitting in rooms that felt different now, not because the people had changed, but because I had. No one spoke over me. No one rephrased my thoughts. When I paused, it wasn't to make space for someone else. It was because I was choosing my words carefully. That distinction mattered more than I expected. Andrew's name surfaced occasionally, not in my inbox, but in passing comments, boardroom updates, brief mentions about transitions and restructuring. Each time, I noticed something surprising. It didn't pull at me. It didn't tighten my chest. It simply passed through like background information, relevant once, no longer central. One afternoon, Michael invited me to lunch to finalize a long-term plan. Nothing dramatic, just structure, protections, clarity. As we talked, he leaned back and said, "You know, most people wait until they're forced to claim their work." I smiled slightly. "I waited until I was ready," I replied. That felt true. I moved apartments that summer, not because the old place held pain, but because it belonged to a chapter that had finished speaking. The new space was smaller, brighter, closer to the river, a place that felt like a decision rather than a compromise. On my first night there, I sat on the floor with a glass of water, windows open, city sounds drifting in, and felt something settle. Stability. Not the fragile kind that depends on keeping others comfortable, but the solid kind that holds even when no one is watching. I started mentoring quietly, not publicly, not as a statement, just one-on-one conversations with women who reminded me of an earlier version of myself, careful, capable, unsure if taking up space was allowed. I told them one thing consistently: document your work, trust your instincts, and never confuse silence with agreement. They listened. That mattered. Late in the year, An invitation arrived for a New Year's Eve gathering, not flashy, not exclusive, just friends, colleagues, people who knew me as myself. I held the card for a long moment, feeling the echo of last year rise, then fade. I accepted. When December came, I stood by the river again, watching lights reflect across the water, thinking about how one night had changed everything, not because of the shock, but because it forced honesty. At midnight, there was no call, no panic, no reversal. Just laughter, warmth, and a quiet certainty that I was exactly where I belonged. And as the new year arrived, I understood something I wished I'd known sooner. You don't lose yourself all at once. You lose yourself slowly, until one day you decide to stop. That decision, once made, changes everything. The weeks after that New Year's Eve didn't rush forward. They unfolded deliberately, like life was giving me time to catch up with myself. I noticed how calm had become my default, not something I worked toward, but something that stayed, even when decisions were hard, even when conversations carried weight. Andrew reached out once that winter, a short message, polite, restrained, asking if I'd be willing to sign a final document related to the separation of assets. No emotion, no subtext, just logistics. I agreed. We met in a conference room downtown, neutral, quiet, sunlight pouring in through tall windows. He looked different, not broken, not defeated, just unanchored, like someone learning to exist without the story that once carried him. We signed without argument. When it was done, he paused, pen still in hand, and said, "You were always stronger than I let myself believe." I met his eyes calmly. "I was always strong," I replied. "You just benefited from pretending I wasn't." He nodded, accepting it, and for the first time, I saw something like peace cross his face. That was enough. Outside, the city felt sharper, clearer, as if winter had stripped away excess, leaving only what mattered. I walked for a while before heading home, letting the air bite gently at my cheeks, reminding me I was fully present. Work continued to grow, not explosively, but sustainably. Partnerships built on transparency, contracts written with clarity instead of trust alone. I learned that stability isn't boring, it's liberating. One evening, I received a message from a woman I'd mentored months earlier, telling me she'd negotiated her first independent credit, her excitement spilling through every line. I read it twice, smiling, realizing how ripples form without intention. That night, sitting at my desk, I opened the old notebook again, the one filled with early ideas, and added a final page. Not plans, not projections, just a simple sentence. Never confuse being loved with being erased. I closed the notebook and placed it on the shelf, not as a reminder of pain, but as evidence of growth. As spring approached, invitations began arriving again, panels, discussions, collaborations, spaces where my presence was expected, not tolerated. I chose carefully, saying yes only when it felt aligned, saying no without guilt when it didn't. And with each choice, I felt something strengthen. Agency. One afternoon, standing by the river, watching the current move steadily forward, I realized how much had changed without fanfare. There was no dramatic victory scene, no final confrontation. Just a woman who no longer needed permission to stand where she belonged. And that realization, quiet and complete, told me the story was nearly finished. Spring arrived without announcement, the way real change often does, slowly, consistently, until one day you realize the light lasts longer and the air feels different. I began to trust that feeling. Not as a reward, but as confirmation. The legal details wrapped up quietly, signatures completed, accounts separated, roles clarified beyond revision. There was no final argument, no dramatic ending, just paperwork doing what it was meant to do, closing doors that had already stopped being lived behind. Andrew respected the distance after that. No late-night calls, no emotional messages disguised as updates, no attempts to reopen conversations that had already reached their natural conclusion. That restraint mattered more than apologies ever could. It meant he understood. My days filled with work that felt intentional, not urgent, conversations that moved forward instead of circling old ground, collaborations built on mutual clarity rather than unspoken expectations. I learned how much energy I'd been spending just maintaining balance in a life that wasn't designed to hold me. Without that effort, everything else felt lighter. One afternoon, while reviewing a proposal, I caught myself smiling for no reason at all, not because something remarkable had happened, but because nothing was wrong. That realization stopped me. For years, peace had felt suspicious, like something temporary, something that needed to be justified. Now, it just existed. I started saying no more often, without explanation, without apology, trusting that the right people didn't require either. And when I said yes, it was because I wanted to, not because I felt obligated to prove something. That shift changed how people interacted with me. They listened more carefully. They respected pauses. They stopped assuming. Late one evening, as I was preparing to shut down my laptop, an email came through from Laura Chin, not requesting an interview, not asking for commentary, just a note. "I've been thinking about your story. Thank you for telling it the way you did." I stared at the screen for a long moment, feeling something warm settle in my chest. Not validation. Recognition. I replied with a simple thank you and closed the computer. That night, standing by the open window, city sounds drifting up, I thought about the woman I had been on that New Year's Eve, standing alone, phone in hand, wondering if silence meant failure. I wished I could reach back and tell her one thing. This isn't the end. It's the moment you stop waiting. As the breeze moved through the room, I realized how rare it is to feel complete without needing to explain why. No audience. No proof. Just alignment. And in that stillness, I understood something that felt both gentle and final. The hardest part wasn't being underestimated. It was learning to stop underestimating myself. By the time summer settled in, the story no longer followed me into rooms the way it used to. People knew it, yes, but they didn't lead with it, and that felt like a kind of respect I hadn't expected. I was no longer the woman from the headlines. I was just Rachel. I hosted small dinners in my new apartment, nothing formal, just friends, colleagues, people who spoke honestly and listened without waiting for their turn. Laughter filled the space easily, not performative, not strategic, just present. I realized how long it had been since I'd felt that kind of ease, without needing to manage it. Work continued to expand in thoughtful ways, projects chosen for alignment rather than optics, collaborations that felt mutual instead of extractive. I learned how powerful it is to say, "That doesn't work for me," and mean it without defensiveness. One afternoon, I received an invitation to speak at a closed session for young founders. Not a keynote, not a spotlight, just a room of people early in their journeys. I agreed, without hesitation. When I stood in front of them, I didn't tell the dramatic parts. I talked about preparation, about documentation, about trusting patterns when they repeat themselves, about how silence can be strategic, but it should never be permanent. A woman in the back raised her hand and asked, "How did you know when it was time to stop waiting?" I didn't answer immediately, because the truth deserved space. "When staying costs more than leaving," I said, "that's when you know." She nodded slowly, like the answer had already been forming inside her. Afterward, I walked alone by the river, watching the water move with purpose, never rushing, never stopping. I thought about how often I'd mistaken patience for loyalty, endurance for love, quiet for peace. They aren't the same. Andrew crossed my mind occasionally, not sharply, not emotionally, just as a closed chapter you acknowledge, without reopening. I hoped he'd found his footing again, but I no longer felt responsible for where he landed. That difference mattered. As autumn approached, another New Year's Eve invitation arrived, this one handwritten, simple, intentional. I smiled when I read it, recognizing the symmetry. How a single night had once marked loss and now marked choice. I pinned the card to the fridge, not as a reminder of the past, but as a signal to myself that I was moving forward on my own terms. That evening, sitting at my desk, I opened a blank document and typed a few words, not a plan, not a goal, just a promise. Never again at the cost of myself. I saved it and closed the laptop, feeling something settle that had nothing to do with success. Readiness. Because the final chapter wasn't about proving anything. It was about choosing what came next, without fear, without permission, and without looking back. And as I turned off the light, I knew the ending was close. Not dramatic, not loud, but honest. Exactly the way it should be. New Year's Eve arrived again, quietly, without pressure, without expectation, just another night that no longer held power over me. I stood by the river with people who knew me as I was now, not as a role, not as a shadow, not as someone to manage, but as myself. The lights reflected across the water, steady and calm, and for the first time I noticed how peaceful it felt not to anticipate anything at all. No countdown anxiety. No phone clenched in my hand. No waiting for permission. When midnight came, there was laughter, gentle embraces, warmth that didn't ask me to perform or explain who I was. I breathed it in slowly, aware of how far I'd traveled without ever leaving the city. I thought back to the woman I had been a year ago, standing alone in an apartment, wondering if silence meant failure, wondering if being excluded meant I didn't matter. I wished I could reach back and tell her something simple and honest. This moment doesn't define you. What you choose next does. I didn't need to watch the clock anymore. Time wasn't chasing me, and I wasn't chasing proof. The world hadn't ended when I stopped shrinking, it had opened. Later that night, back home, I took off my coat, set my keys down, and noticed how natural the space felt, how nothing in it belonged to someone else's expectations. That quiet was no longer empty. It was full. I opened my laptop briefly, not to check headlines, not to respond to messages, but to write one last sentence, a reminder I didn't want to forget. I am allowed to be seen. Then I closed it. Because this story wasn't about becoming someone new. It was about returning to who I had always been, without apology, without permission, without fear of making others uncomfortable. And if you're listening to this now, still wondering whether choosing yourself will cost you too much, hear this clearly. The cost of disappearing is always higher. Thank you for listening to my story. Before you go, tell me in the comments which moment hit you the hardest. And if you want more stories of strength, healing, and unexpected victories, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one. Because sometimes the quietest endings are the strongest beginnings.